A few weeks back, I was at Rockfield Studios in South Wales recording a cover of Don't Look Back in Anger. But after that session was completed, I made a long overdue pilgrimage just 5 minutes up the road to check out another historic Oasis studio. It's Wednesday morning, our session at Rockfield is complete, but before driving back up north to Yorkshire, we came to check out this place. This is Monnow Valley, a recording studio that has been used by an impressive lineup of bands and artists for decades. Rockfield Studios is just down there. And Monnow Valley is just down there. Monnow Valley was Oasis's first time at an industry standard, top level pro recording studio, and they were going there to record their debut album, Definitely Maybe.
Looking back on it, I think it was probably a lack of live performance that hampered them sessions. And we were there for a while. I think we must have been there for 3 weeks or something.
So I was a bit like, well, I'm scared, but I'm not scared to the point of I won't write a cheque.
5 lads again, down to a studio, you got a couple of weeks in there, big studio, river running through it. So it's amazing. Gonna sound great.
I absolutely love Rockfield. I love its kind of indie rock history and the way it feels to be there, like you're stepping into a legend. But Monnow Valley is a very different animal, even though it's just 5 minutes up the road. I don't know if you can hear it in the background, but there's a mile of fishing river right there that comes with the venue. Now here we have what I think probably used to be the control room, because we've got the glass window between them. Now it is a really cool games room with a dartboard and a pool table. And out there, past the fridge and the popcorn machine, there's a barbecue and there's a hot tub and there's a seating area. To be honest, I am really impressed with the facilities at Monnow Valley. It's my first time here and I'm sorely tempted to come back. Before joining Oasis in 1991, Noel had worked as a roadie for Manchester band Inspiral Carpets. In the Supersonic book he says this guy called Dave Batchelor got to produce the first incarnation of Definitely Maybe. That was all my fault. He'd done a festival run with the Inspiral Carpets 4 or 5 years before. I remember travelling around Europe with him and talking about music and punk rock, and I thought he was a fucking cool guy. When it came to the question of who do you want to produce your first album, I said, I want this guy to do it. Alan McGee adds, Noel had bonded with the guy and promised him he could do his album. Because he'd promised it, I gave Dave a chance, but it was fucking wrong. So that was the producer, Dave Batchelor, and now for the engineer, Dave Scott. Back in the days before Noel or Liam joined Oasis, the band was called The Rain and had 4 members, Bonehead, Grigsy, Tony McCarroll and a singer called Chris Hutton. And sound engineer Dave Scott's time with the band actually predates Noel and Liam because he recorded The Rain. Dave says, we first met in Manchester at a studio called Out of the Blue. I was recording and producing a session for Bonehead's band The Rain, which also included Grigsy and Tony McCarroll. But they had this guy as a lead singer who was quite useless. We all got on really well, even after I commented on the band's need for a new singer. Later on in the session, this guy turned up with some guitars for Bonehead's overdubs. He said he reckoned his younger brother could do a better job on the vocals. The guy with the guitars and the younger brother turned out to be Noel. I've not been able to track down these recordings of The Rain, but the band did go back to Out of the Blue again, and they made a 3-track demo after Noel and Liam had joined. This was recorded in 1991. It's got 3 songs on it, including the popular early track Take Me, written by Liam and Bonehead. And look at the notes on the tape. Noel joined the band, if this is right, on rhythm guitar, and Bonehead was originally the lead guitarist. Dave Scott stayed in touch with the band. They used him as engineer on their session at the Motor Museum, where Supersonic was recorded, and from there, Noel Gallagher invited him to come and be the engineer for Definitely Maybe.
Noel phoned me up about Christmas, just after Christmas, about a month after we'd done Supersonic, and said, "Do you want to come and make my album?" I was like, "Great, yeah, nice one." Because it was, to be honest, it was one of the first bands I'd worked with for a long time that I actually enjoyed, I really enjoyed. I thought, yeah, great, sound.
However, there was apparently tension between the two Daves, Dave Scott and Dave Batchelor, engineer and producer, pretty much from the word go. Dave Scott says this: "I personally felt that Dave Batchelor was unhappy because Noel had chosen me to be the engineer. I think he would have liked to have had that choice. I think, as producer, he should have had the say. I couldn't connect with him artistically or technically, neither could I get any idea from him what his vision for the album was. This made life very difficult for me. I had rarely worked under other producers, and when I had, there had always been a collaboration. I think that the lack of direction and different expectations led to an uncoordinated session with too many compromises." As the studio sessions began and progressed, relationships also began to break down between Dave Batchelor and the band, as the producer repeatedly failed to accurately capture what the band sounded like. Oasis had been signed in part for their larger-than-life wall of guitars sound, but the recordings Dave Batchelor was making were sounding thin and weak, and it was negatively affecting the relationship between band and producer. In the Supersonic book, Noel says, "I remember it becoming frustrating. It's fucking easy. I've written all the songs, I've come up with all the parts for everyone. Fucking hell, what else do you want me to do? Make the tea? We had a producer in the room. It's his job to make it sound good. I know what I'm doing. If everyone else knows what they're doing, what could possibly go wrong?" Bonehead says, "I presumed that we were going to get in, and 1, 2, 3, 4, away we go. But it wasn't like that. It was take after take after take." And Liam says, "I didn't like that. That did my head in. It felt like you were on the naughty step all the time." Dave Scott also saw that things were falling apart between the band and their producer. He said, "I don't think there was enough emphasis on it being a band. All communication was done through Noel. Myself and Coyley were treated as inconveniences and the rest of the band as children. I think this existed right from the start, but it became annoying and more apparent as time went on. I can't say too much here because Dave Batchelor fired me after a couple of weeks." In the Supersonic book, Bonehead said, "We would go into the control room and listen back, and Dave just wasn't getting it. At some points, things would get pretty tense." And Mark Coyle adds, "They all knew that it was no good." Noel said, "We did one version of the album, which we mixed a fucking 1,000 times. It can become like a dog chasing its tail. We went away on tour, and the tapes were sent off to be mixed. Your manager turns up with a cassette, and it's fucking awful. The feedback coming back is, it sounds shit." The album sessions were famously a complete flop, and still to this day, only small selected bits and pieces have ever been released to the public. There's a few very poorly mixed moments from the Monnow Valley version of Cigarettes and Alcohol on the Supersonic film. The Monnow Valley version of Bring It On Down was released on the Japanese 3-CD version of Definitely Maybe in 2014, and you can find this version on YouTube. But aside from those two rarities, the only track to actually make it into the public domain was the song Slide Away.
Well, they had the album planned, they knew what songs they wanted to use, but occasionally, as with Supersonic, Noel would come out with something new, and that had to go on the album. It happened when we were at Monnow Valley. Slide Away came about just while he was jamming, Slide Away happened, and that ended up on the album.
Many songwriters have had the slightly magical experience of a pretty much fully formed song just landing in their head. You grab a piece of paper and a pen, write it down, and there it is, basically finished. Slide Away, apparently, was one of these songs. It was both written and recorded on the Monnow Valley sessions, and it was the only song from those sessions to make it onto Definitely Maybe.
I'd been on tour and we'd actually phoned Johnny Marr and asked him could we borrow some of his guitars because we didn't have that many. And he sends down this Les Paul, and I swear to you, I took it out of the fucking case, and I had a bedroom above one of the live rooms, and it turned up in the morning, and I took it to my bedroom, I picked it out of the case and I sat down and the fucking song wrote itself.
And so, Johnny Marr came to the rescue, and you can actually see his guitar on the floor in the Supersonic photo shoot. In an interview with Associated Press in December 95, Noel Gallagher was asked which of his songs meant the most to him. He chose 4 songs, one of which was Slide Away, saying this: Slide Away because it's about a relationship from about 2 or 3 years ago with a real person. I've forgotten what her name is anyway, he jokes. Again, in an interview from earlier that same year with Addicted to Noise, Noel Gallagher said this: The journalist asked him which Oasis song is most you. Noel gave 4 answers, one of which was Slide Away, adding, some of the new stuff is really me. The journalist asked, so they do tend to be autobiographical? Noel responded, you can't really help it. And so the journalist asked another question about the song Married with Children. So did your ex-girlfriend really say, all your music is shit? And Noel responded by saying, yeah, she did. In multiple sources and various different places, Noel Gallagher has confirmed that Slide Away was written for his ex-girlfriend, Louise Jones, who has, interestingly, since her split from Noel, pretty much completely vanished from history. So, despite all the bad luck at Monnow Valley, despite the bad blood between the engineer and the producer, and the growing frustration between the producer and the band, there was a little bit of light in the darkness. Slide Away. However, actually recording Slide Away was just as arduous a process as everything else had been at Monnow Valley, and that song, in the end, cost them their sound engineer. Here's the story leading up to the recording of that song, as told by Gwigsy in Paolo Hewitt's book, Getting High. It's about 4 or 5 in the morning, Gwigsy remembers, and everyone is drifting off to bed. But Bonehead is still going, and he wants to speak to people. Everyone's in their rooms, and it's pure country quiet where you can hear everything. And you can hear him walking downstairs going, what do I do? What do I do? I know, phone people up. So after he's tried a few people, he decides to ring the Stone Roses. John Squire comes on the phone, and Bonehead puts on a Rasta accent, offering to meet him at the corner and sell him some toot. Then he puts the phone down and rings John Squire again, only this time he's an Indian curry shop owner with their takeaway orders. Eventually he goes to bed, but then he opens up his bedroom window and starts shouting at the rabbits outside, telling them to go to bed. And that, of course, wakes everyone up. The next morning I'm eating breakfast and Bonehead comes downstairs, and he sits next to me just farting and laughing his head off. But when Noel comes down, he's double grumpy. Noel sends him to bed, so Bonehead leaves, and Noel tells me that he's going to kill him when he wakes up. So, to calm Noel down, I take him into town. I buy him the papers, some pot noodles, crisps, cream cakes, all the stuff he likes, and then we pop into the pub at about 10:30. We end up staying till 5:30 in the evening, and we are proper off our faces. And then we go back to the studio. When we get there, Bonehead is avoiding us. Noel walks into the studio and goes, right you bastards, we'll do Slide Away. After each take, we got more and more off our heads, but Noel says to Bonehead, you're staying straight, you're not getting off it ever again. And it was one of these takes that we ended up using on the album. Things were clearly seriously fraught in the studio at this point, not just amongst the band, but also behind the glass. In the book Supersonic Supernova, Dave Scott said that Dave Batchelor was trying to record Slide Away at the same speed and with a similar arrangement to Comfortably Numb by Pink Floyd, very, very slow, and it just wasn't working. and according to future sound engineer Angeli Dutt, that version was kept because when she joined the session in future months, she was able to listen to it. In an interview with David Huggins of Oasis Recording Info, Angeli said this: "There was a pompous version of Slide Away that just felt all wrong and just didn't work at all. Echoes of faux Guns N' Roses even come to mind, especially in the solos." So it's highly likely that this alternative version of Slide Away is still out there somewhere in the Big Brother vaults. In a different interview, Dave Scott goes on to talk about the tension between Dave Batchelor and Tony McCarroll, and also just how long that original version of Slide Away ended up being. On the original recording of Slide Away at Monnow Valley, Noel did some very amusing ad-lib vocals on the guide track, imitating Scousers and the like. The full recording must have been about 10 minutes long. Tony the drummer couldn't understand the concept of alternating between his two crash cymbals so that we didn't have all the crashes on one side of the stereo image. So Dave Batchelor had to stand in front of him during the recording and point to each cymbal in turn so he knew which one to hit. I wish we had video of this because it was priceless. And that suggests to me that Griggsy was telling the truth. They were all completely off their faces and Tony had probably overdone it a bit. The battle over the tempo of Slide Away apparently went back and forth for hours until engineer Dave Scott fell on his sword and literally got himself fired to ensure that the correct version of Slide Away, the one we know and love today, was actually committed to tape. The tempo of Slide Away was one of the issues that got me fired eventually. We'd been trying to record the song for hours and it was getting really tedious. Not because of the song itself, but because Dave had this tempo in his head that would have made the song something completely different, and the band just couldn't play it that slow. After many hours of just being the recording engineer, I had to say something. I suggested a tempo that I thought they could deal with. Bonehead and Liam instantly said, "That's it." We then got the take in the next 20 minutes, but Batchelor was livid. It was his call, and I suppose I was out of order, but someone had to rescue the situation, even if it cost me my job. The other clash was when we were doing some lead guitars on either Slide Away or Live Forever. I can't remember which. Batchelor had Noel do solo after solo after solo, which is okay, but he wanted them all recording. When I said, "I'm out of tracks, which do you want me to go over?" he said, "Just record it." I repeated my question and still got no response other than anger. It's okay for a musician to behave like that, but the producer has to interface the technical with the artistic. So the band got the final version of Slide Away in the can, but Dave Batchelor fired Dave Scott over the incident, and then a few weeks later, Noel had to bite the bullet and fire Dave Batchelor. Noel said this in Mojo in January 1995. "When it came to sitting at the mixing desk, I'm saying, let's get a bit mad here, let's really let go and be young and compress the shit out of this so the speakers blow up. And he'd go, nope, because this is the way we done it in our day, son." I thought we either go with his saneness or my madness, and I'm in charge. So sorry mate, you've got to go. But once again, out of all that turmoil and all that conflict, not only did Noel Gallagher write one of his best songs of that era, also Liam Gallagher recorded one of his best vocals of all time. Many of the fans and even much of the band recognised that this was Liam Gallagher's finest moment.
I think that's his best ever singing on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one song that survived from the first ever Definitely Maybe sessions, the ones that were scrapped.
Apparently they done it. I don't know whether that was part of the album sessions, but I've heard that that was the vocal, and they had to kind of build stuff around it. Or when you're trying to get a track right, it was like, well, that's a keeper, and it's amazing.
Best ever vocal delivery I think that Liam's ever got in his life.
Fantastic vocal.
Amazing. Like, means it.
It's a good tune, man. I like singing it,
But while things were really fraught and difficult in the studio, there were some high points and some bright points outside the studio, and that came from the Stone Roses. Remember how Griggsy told us that a very stoned bonehead called up John Squire? How did he know where to find him? Because they were just up the road, 5 minutes up the road at Rockfield Studios, recording Second Coming.
You know, quite interesting, the Stone Roses were about a mile down the road in Rockfield, which is the other studio in that area, so they began to, you know, bond a little bit with some of the guys out of the Roses when they had some spare time.
During the few short weeks that Oasis were at Monnow Valley Studios, they hung out with the Stone Roses on multiple occasions, and Tony McCarroll tells the story of one of the first times they met up. We were off to Monmouth to record at Monnow Valley Recording Studios. The Stone Roses were making Second Coming a few miles away at Rockfield. We decided it would be a good thing to see if we could find Ian Brown, but this decision was unwise for a number of reasons. We didn't know where the studio was, it was pitch black with no streetlights, and we had no transport. Ian Brown was probably asleep in bed, and it was 2:30 in the morning. And we were completely out of our heads. However, after what seemed an eternity, we had left the glow of the town and were in the heart of the countryside. We arrived at Rockfield Studios and crept up the gravel driveway. It was nearly 3 in the morning when we knocked on the door, but no one answered. So we tried the door, and to our surprise, it opened. And inside, we saw a ping pong table. So, having been to Rockfield Studios multiple times myself, I can tell you where they were at this point. Tony McCarroll, Liam, and Paul Ashby, who was a friend of the band, had walked up the drive and turned left into the quadrangle courtyard. They had let themselves into the quadrangle studio, turned left and gone into the big room where the ping pong table is kept. We had obviously caught someone's attention as we heard an inside door swing open and then crash shut, followed by heavy footsteps on the stone. Even though we hadn't done anything wrong, we each dived behind one of the many stone pillars supporting the barn roof. Now at this point, knowing Rockfield reasonably well, I began to wonder what Tony was on about, and then I realised, 3 in the morning, totally stoned, they were trying to hide behind these wooden pillars. Whoever had come to investigate had brought with them the power of light, and after flicking a switch, we were all illuminated in the courtyard. "What the fuck are you doing?" inquired a voice from the doorway. I suppose we should have moved, but instead we stood firm in the crazy belief we couldn't be seen. "I'm calling the old bill if you don't leave," the voice continued. Again, I can say with some confidence that voice probably belonged to this man, Kingsley, the owner and founder of Rockfield. We sheepishly returned to the courtyard. I put my hands up in mock surrender, and the others followed suit. "We're here to see Ian Brown. We're in a band called Oasis." As was now becoming common, the name drop worked. We were ushered into the building and pointed towards a door at the far end of a long corridor. I've been able to confirm that Kingsley took them from the quadrangle to the coach house, which is the other studio at Rockfield, where Ian Brown was recording and a young Nick Bryan was sat at the mixing desk. As we opened the door, we saw a slouched Ian Brown sitting in a leather chair. Behind, working away at a mixing desk, was an engineer. "Morning," muttered the lead singer, who was surrounded by a cloud of smoke as he pulled on a fat one. "Come in, sit down," he said. But nobody moved. We just stood in the doorway and stared. This was the man who had inspired most of the band to become musicians, and in particular, Liam. We took our seats either side of Ian Brown, who then started to talk like talking was about to be outlawed. Here's a few things he said. "I'm a fly in the ointment, but I don't want to be no fly in the bottle. They ain't got anything to pin on me. It's not just swings and roundabouts, there's also the slide to consider. The paling of the shadows are a sure sign of the morning light." What the fuck? This dialogue made the weirdness of the trip even more intense. I was waiting for Liam to start monkeying around, but it seemed it was all a little too much for him. He just simply sat there, staring straight at the Roses singer, but unable to say anything. The mouth was firmly shut, and he simply nodded as Mr. Brown started to confuse everybody again. "Is Rennie around?" I asked, after Ian finished another 4 or so sentences that, when stringed together, didn't actually mean anything. Ian replied, "He'll be here in a couple of hours, but we'll all have to be gone by then. The rule of one cannot be the rule of all." He is a right fucking weirdo, I thought to myself. We managed a sort of conversation for the next hour, which mainly consisted of one of us asking a question that was followed by an unrelated prophecy or bizarre answer from Mr. Brown. "Why don't you change the name of that song to Cigarettes and Coffee? It sounds better." This was Ian Brown's final piece of advice. And not a peep out of Liam all night. Strange that. The next day at Monnow Valley was the iconic photo shoot for the Oasis Supersonic single.
In the room behind me is one of the coolest rehearsal spaces I've ever seen for a band.
There's the big glass room you've been seeing from the outside. Let's have a look inside. This is the view from the inside, but let me just zoom out a bit. Do you recognise those doors? I've seen so many pictures of this room and I didn't realise how absolutely massive it is. So, as you can see from the huge wooden doors, this is the room Oasis recorded in, but also this is the room that Michael Spencer Jones photographed for the Supersonic cover. And just to give you the idea of the size of this room, I'm quite a tall bloke, and this is where I stand on the doors.
I remember being in this big old sort of churchy kind of a hallway thing, big ceiling going on and all that.
I wasn't there much in the studio. You know, I don't like hanging out in studios because there's not a lot you can do there as a manager. So I just kind of visit like once a week or something and check and see if everything's okay. You know, they knew that they were very confident about how good the songs were and how good they were.
Tony picks up the story. The next morning, we were getting our photo taken for the Supersonic single. I was grateful for my position at the back of the shot, as I was still spinning from the previous evening and early morning. There was still no sign of Liam. He finally trudged into the room looking downcast. He was wearing the same denim shirt and jeans as the previous night. I thought that maybe his meeting with Ian Brown wasn't what he had expected. Sleeve designer Brian Cannon asked us to take up our instruments and look rebellious. When the resulting shots were shown to us, I noticed that depressed, vacant stare still on display across Liam's face. But that wasn't the only encounter between Oasis and the Stone Roses at Monnow Valley. Next up, it seems that Manny paid them a visit in the middle of the night, but for a different reason.
Yeah, well, it was like probably 2 in the morning or something, and someone's going, "They're going to have booze down there, definitely." So, and we was on mushrooms as well. We'd had a bit of a boil up. So I managed to get the tractor going, tripping my tits off, and proceeded in an easterly direction down to Monnow Valley. Got there, I think everyone was in bed. So then went skulking around people's rooms while they were asleep. And I think I've spotted a big nugget of hashish by the side of somebody's bed, and I think I was reaching over to grab it, and they were like, I was just petrified because I think I'd give them this ghost story thing a few days earlier about the ghost of Monnow Valley and stuff.
And Nick Brine, sound engineer on the Stone Roses session at Rockfield, was able to confirm this and to show us the tractor.
So another little bit of Rockfield history. Tractor down there, that's the one that Manny stole one night to go down to Monnow Valley. He didn't drive, didn't have a car. How was he going to get there? Who's going to have weed? Obviously Quigsy will have weed, and we'll get on the tractor and we'll get down there, get some weed off Quigsy on Kingsley's tractor. Still here, they never sell anything here, so it's everything's still here. Turned up in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning. Quigsy wondering what the fuck the noise was outside his bedroom window. It's Manny on the tractor.
Now, I'm going to walk you through to the next room because it's also a room with a little bit of Oasis history. But if you hear this, that is the sound of my shoes sticking to the dried champagne that whoever was in before got literally all over pretty much every downstairs floor. So this is still very much a rock and roll venue. This is the room where Bonehead famously hooked up a fishing wire and connected it to various items like a shoe and a newspaper to convince Liam that Monnow Valley was haunted. In the Supersonic book, Bonehead says, one day one of the staff casually mentioned, "So who's sleeping in room number 3? Liam says, "That's me." And she says, "All right, you've got the haunted one then." So Liam, of course, was just shitting it. Liam says, "I go to bed one night and then I wake up in the morning and all the furniture has been moved around. I go downstairs saying, 'Look, it must be haunted, I've got to change room.'" Bonehead says, "By the front door there are a load of fishing rods, so I got some fishing line off one and looped it through a little hole in the corner of the Daily Mirror. I put a bit of fishing line through the laces of somebody's trainers as well. Everyone else knew about it, but Liam didn't. We were all watching football and I just started pulling this line. Then I really tugged it so the whole newspaper just went flying across the table. Of course we all jumped up and Liam was shitting it because he didn't know anything about it. So he really jumped up. Someone tugged the trainers, so as he headed for the door, a pair of Adidas trainers just scooted across the floor, chasing him out. He was done. He was off, down the fields. See you later, Liam." And this is Liam's bedroom, the haunted room 3. Let's have a look inside. Now, one of the great things about running this channel is the amount of people I've got to meet who were there during many of these historic sessions. By talking to people and interviewing people, I've been able to set the record straight about what actually happened in quite a lot of Oasis history. But while doing that, I've also been able to pick up a few previously unheard stories as well. And here's one of them. At this time, while Oasis were at Monnow Valley, they were very much aspiring to catch up to the Stone Roses. In fact, the whole reason they went to Rockfield for the next album was because the Stone Roses had been there for their second album. At that time, the Stone Roses basically were their musical heroes. And so, after they were a few weeks into the Monnow Valley sessions and they had some songs mixed down onto tape, Bonehead and Liam took another trip over to Rockfield and they met Nick Bryan on the driveway. They gave him a cassette and asked him to pass it on to the Stone Roses to see what they thought. It's amazing to think, isn't it, that at one point Oasis were in the position that so many bands and musicians are in now, trying to get their stuff heard by industry insiders. But the tracks they sent to the Roses were the aborted Monnow Valley sessions. The songs were great, but the mixes were absolutely terrible. According to Nick, apparently the Roses didn't listen for a little while, but Oasis kept checking in, calling up to see if they'd heard the demo yet. And so, eventually, the Roses played the tape. But, of course, they heard these very rough versions of the songs, which basically sounded crap. The Stone Roses, however, chose to respond kindly and honestly, saying, "Well done, lads, keep working at it." So, if you're in a band, or if you're a musician struggling to get heard and struggling to get appreciated, don't give up, because even the biggest acts in the country were once in exactly the same position.
I think a lot of it was more with Noel, sort of Marcus, Alan McGee, just panic stations, listening back to monitor mixes, just going, this ain't happening.
After a couple of weeks of deliberations, they decided to basically start it all again.
I'll always respect McGee for that. He just said, look, fucking go and do it again. And we were like, you sure? And he was like, just go and do it again because you've got to get it right.
And so, as is common knowledge, everything from the Monnow Valley sessions ended up being scrapped, except for Slide Away. But all those long-lost tracks absolutely fascinate me, because there's a whole album's worth of unreleased gems that were made in the absolute golden age of Liam Gallagher's vocals. This was apparently Liam Gallagher's absolute vocal peak, and we've only heard one properly produced and mixed song from the sessions. What about the rest of it? It's all from the same sessions, so why can't the rest of it be properly produced, mixed, EQ'd and brickwalled to sound like Slide Away? Liam Gallagher was a fantastic singer all the way through the 90s, but this, according to most fans and the band, was his high point. The two other snippets we've heard, they aren't mixed or produced in the same way. Those are very weak vanilla mixes, but the tracks can be turned into that definitely maybe pile driving sound. We know they can be because Owen Morris did it with Slide Away.
The deliveries was all good. It was just the way it was. I think it was just the you know, the actual vibe of the thing and the way it sounded. It just sounded soft. It didn't sound, you know, there was no edge to it.
What's the difference between the Whitfield Street version of Slide Away and the Definitely Maybe version? It's not the stems. It's not the band's performances. It's not the gear they were using. The only difference between that version of Slide Away and the final version is the post-production and the mix. I think today, especially with the incredible production tools that didn't exist in '93, that lost first version of the album really could be cleaned up, correctly mixed and EQ'd and brickwalled just as Slide Away was, and re-released as a special edition for the fans. Just for the sheer history of it. And I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting to hear that original, really slow 10-minute version of Slide Away. Of course, it's not going to stand up to the original, but that's not the point. Wouldn't it be amazing to hear the young Liam's voice again, doing versions of the songs we've never heard before, and some of Noel Gallagher's guitar parts that never made it? How many of us would immediately snap up a vinyl and CD copy of that lost album? Definitely maybe would go to number 1, again. But what do you think? Will we ever get to hear that lost album from the golden age of Liam Gallagher's vocals? Definitely? Or only maybe?
And there it is. It's a beautiful day in South Wales. Sun is shining. Birds are singing. And I've just been in a legendary recording studio where the cream of the British rock and roll scene since the 60s have recorded. And not only that, but I've also been in the same place that Noel wrote and the band recorded Slide Away.
If you live down south, don't forget I'm playing at the Globe in Lowestoft on Friday the 5th of August. It would be great to see you there. The link to tickets is in the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.